My name is Andrew Predmore. I am, what does it say on the slide? A lead developer for a company called Pixel. And do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Bernardo Martinez, and I work as the senior front-end developer for this project. And together, we will be speaking about single directory components and recipes at SBA.gov. Sure.
Oh, you want?
Sure, you can go first.
Sorry, this is our first time co-presenting. We're still working it out. He said single directory components and recipes. These are two separate things that overlap in a Venn diagram. A single directory component is used in theming, and it separates theming one thing into a separate folder, so it can be reused efficiently, modularly. And a recipe can be a lot of things, but at its most basic level, it is a set of configuration separate from a module that can be used in other projects.
How many of you, by show of hands, have used SDCs and recipes? Let's go with SDCs first. How many of you are familiar with SDCs? How many of you implemented SDCs? Okay, cool. That's about half the room. How about recipes? How many of you are familiar with recipes? How many of you have implemented recipes? Oh, cool. That's a little smaller.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
What we're aiming at.
For sure. And that's not surprising because, as you probably know, recipes and SDCs have been stable for about a year now. We had it in core as an initiative for about 5 years, but you couldn't really use it in production until recently. So a lot of people are still getting on board with that and getting familiar with it.
Okay.
So
this is the SDC one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in the file structure of an SDC, as I said, it's in a separate folder. So here we have a theme, and the themes folder, which you're all if you use Drupal, you're familiar with. And then we have a custom theme for SBA, and inside the components, the single directory components, there's a folder, and we've expanded the one called Hero. The hero.component.yaml is not required by the theme, right, because the theme uses other tools, but it is required if you're using modules or other things like that. And the component.yaml stores the meta information about the component. We are using SAS, the .scss extension, because our base theme is the USWDS, the United States Web Design System. And since they use SAS, our SAS files are consumed and compiled into the USWDS and globally scoped. And then in order to add this component, you can do it two ways, either with an embed statement, and we might show that in a demo later, or an include statement to add these components in.
If you're using USWDS, you probably know you're likely using Gulp and a couple of other builders, and that makes it a little more challenging to do the scoping for the component, because SDC is supposed to be self-contained, but if you have USWDS in the mix, you kind of have to somehow tell it that you're using some of the classes from it. So that's why for a custom component we have a .scss file, and we are just piping that in as an entry point in the Gulp file, and then Gulp knows about it, and then it can compile those classes as well. And I'll show that in a demo, so you have the whole experience. But ideally, you will have most of the code in the .css, because then that will load on demand as you need it instead of globally. Because that's one of the constraints that you have sometimes when you have USWDS, because you have to load the styles nearly in every other place that you need them.
And that's a good point. Both of these tools, the single directory components and the recipes, need to be integrated into your existing workflow, and there is still some learning and manual steps to get these in. It's not as seamless as using Composer and just updating a module or things like that yet. So we, but it is, excuse me, it is getting better and more helpful. Okay, so
Sorry, we have.
I skipped one. So this is a recipe. A recipe, like I said before, is an example of configuration that you want to reuse across multiple sites. If you've been in Drupal for a long time, you may remember an old tool called Features. This is better. So a recipe, what you do is, and this does take manual work right now, because if you're creating your own, there are quite a few available from Drupal, and we're building quite a few that we're reusing across different properties. But they do take a little work, because you have to export the config, or find the config files that you need from that giant config sync folder that you have, and move them into this. And so you need to, for instance, if you were to implement a small recipe that's just a new field, or a new content type, or a new field, you would find the field storage, your core entity form displays, your core entity view displays. You would find all of those, move them into these folders, and then the key is, when you got those, look at one of the things, a hint more is better. Then open up those YAML files and look for the dependencies that are listed, and make sure you trace back, and either your dependencies, things that are dependent, either need to be in the same folder as part of this recipe, or they need to be already part of Drupal core or turned on, so things like media types and things like that, or they need to be in another recipe that you're including. And one hint is, if you're copying from the config sync, you can remove those universal unique IDs, the UUIDs, just to keep things clean.
And as you may know, there's different types of recipes, and we will cover a little bit about that, because recipes is just a big word from some configuration that's bundled. You can do it for a paragraph type, you can do it for a content type, you could do it for a starter kit where you just bundle multiple paragraphs and multiple content types, and we will showcase that in an example later as well. But the last note about this is that something that you want to keep in mind when you are copying the configuration is just to make sure that anything that you have on that paragraph button or any other type of paragraph comes through. So if you have translations turned on, you sometimes have to copy that configuration. That configuration, you will think like, oh, where did you get all those files? And well, that's actually just Drupal core config. For the most part, that's fairly simple, except for when you're going from like 10 to 11. Because, as you extract some of that configuration, Drupal doesn't know where it lives. So if you're trying to have a library of recipes in Drupal 10, and Drupal 11 changed the schema or something about that YAML file, you may have a little bit of an issue there migrating the recipe. But you can create it manually and just see what fields changed. And now you can handle the YAML file as an extension of that, instead of just committing it and never touching it and letting it be by itself.
We forgot to tell them at the beginning, but we can take questions during the presentation. So is there any questions right now about what we said so far? If the answer is way too long, we'll push it off. But anybody curious about something or not understanding what we said, please let us know. Okay, so we work on the Small Business Administration, the main website, www.sba.gov. And what happened, let's see, next slide here. There, yep. So what we have built is a fairly complicated site, so that the editors can create many different layouts with many different styles, and of course this is all accessible and resizable and things like that. and you can see the list of different types. So we did that over the last few years, and now we're being asked to host some of the other subdomains, like data.sba.gov, and work on those. And we were looking for a way to reuse all this work we did on these new sites.
Because as you know, I mean, in Drupal, when you go through the site creation process and the first pass of any site, you probably have to do some of that configuration through the UI, but ideally you wouldn't do that twice, and ideally you wouldn't happen to stumble upon different machine names, because that can affect your SDCs and your styling, because now if the configuration can be very similar when you have a SDC library, then it's just plug and play. If your configuration is different because you changed the paragraph type name or the fields, you might have a challenge just moving those libraries together. And this kind of brings it into place so we can have them bundle up.
So very briefly, some screenshots of the Small Business Administration site going back. In 2016, going way back, this is before the standardized styles came in. 2018 looks a little bit better and a little bit different. That's about the time they were on. Well, we'll go on which one they were on in the next slide. Around 2021, 2022 is when we took over. They had a mix of Drupal 7 and Drupal 8, all from the same domain, with a React front end, and it was becoming completely unmaintainable. It was almost impossible to update because they hadn't been built with Composer. So it was hard to get security updates out for the backend, Drupal backend. It was hard because we had been handed a React front end. It was very hard to understand what the other people had written. And then now in 2025, this is pure Drupal. Drupal backend, Drupal front end, US WDS theme, so standardized government theme. And even though we had built all this and it looked great, we started thinking, how can we make this better? Let's future-proof it with the SDCs and recipes and other things that we're working on.
Another consideration that came into play is the fact that if you look at that page, there's different components, and those components are probably what the end user expects to see, whether that's a card or a CTA. And it'd be fantastic if those components were somewhat standardized in a way that we could go back and maybe look at what was involved. But because they were so tightly coupled to the CMS or the system in which they were built, there's no way for us to tell. Because even if we find the twig file for like a Drupal 7 one, the style sheet is probably massive and nothing is extracted and bundled up by component. So that's one of the big benefits that SDC gives us, that hopefully in the future we could be like, the hero that we had in 2025, we like that one. Where's the single directory component for that? And either grab chunks of the SCSS, the CSS, or the twig, and then maybe use it for something else. Maybe repurpose some of this stuff. We are losing a lot of knowledge and investment when we have to rebuild from scratch and potentially lose some of those things.
And this is just a repeat of the timeline from the previous slide. 2016, they started out with Drupal 7, front end, back end. Everything was rolling pretty smoothly. But in 2018, we're not sure. I'm pretty sure it was Drupal 7 still, but they did decide that they want to do a dynamic front end headless setup. So React 15 or Data React Root. And by 2021, most of the site had gone to Drupal 8 and there was this giant React code base responding to the Drupal 8 APIs. Yes?
Do you mind questions now? Or?
Yeah, that's fine.
So what went wrong with React? You said giant code base?
So the React has a purpose, but the way they had built it, if there is a standard for integrating React with Drupal, the contractor didn't do that. They hand built everything, and they had apps and other things that they had, everything was hand built. And if you're not a React developer, it's very, very hard to tell what's going on at all. Especially if you, I mean, when we would load pages and we go to view source, and it would be like 2 lines of JavaScript. And we couldn't even inspect the HTML or the CSS or anything. So for us, it was a big problem. And then we would go to the React code base, and it was very hard. We couldn't find how does this content type get displayed, or how does this paragraph gets displayed. We couldn't even find something that said show an article. You know, it was not built in a way that was understandable to us.
Because usually it's like React is like the hotness, the front end hotness is staying, right? But this is a different take on it. Could be a team organizational thing.
Yeah, I think it was just a lot of tech debt. You know, the React definitely has a place, and it's used in the government. I believe VA.gov uses React extensively. It's just that when we got to this, there was so much tech debt, and they were having, like I said, they were having so much trouble keeping security and maintenance. And this, for the most part, is just a content site, right? There was no real reason to build this giant React head when you're just serving articles, blog posts, and documents. You know, those are all.
My last comment is, I assume you have the typical stuff like varnish and CDN in front of you right now.
Yeah, we use load balancers and a CDN and all that. And so in 2025, I was brought in like January 2022. My specialty is migrations, and so I dove in, and with another coworker, we started translating all of the old content types from 7 and 8 into Drupal. At the time, it was Drupal 9, 8 or 9, and but we rebuilt the whole thing from scratch, and then I ran an actual Drupal to Drupal migration for all the content types. Only a few at a time, because we were working on a live site, so it took about 2 years to do. From the start of the planning to the final day where I said, this is the final migration I'll have to run. So
just to add up to that, I know another challenge we had was that when they did it in React, they decided to go full on microservices. And as you know, microservices had the issue that now you have to debug it into multiple layers and have different services spin up for just that purpose. So I know that was a challenge that the team dealt with right before I came in, and I've seen that, and we heard that from other agencies where they're struggling with that, because you lose the ability to have the caching that Drupal provides out of the box. It doesn't bubble up right away. They had to wait a couple of hours, an hour or two, for the edits to be on the front end, and that can be too long for any kind of executive to try to see something happening. And that's just part of the nature of like having microservices and different caching layers outside of Drupal, and Drupal not knowing about them.
Yeah, I had actually forgotten about that. Yeah. So it wasn't talking directly to Drupal APIs. There's a whole layer that would build all the data that was needed for a page, and then put it in a JSON file or something, and then React would get that file. So yeah, there was a delay. Because like once an hour, it would rebuild all the nodes that it changed. I had forgotten about that. So some of the types that, when we're dealing with both recipes and SDCs, more SDCs, visually and layout-wise, these look different, but the components are very similar. So paragraph types, all have similar white space, all have similar heading, similar buttons, right? And then, and some of them have images, and so that's a really good place for an SDC.
So as we looked at what we could do to consolidate and make the workflow that we had for us easier, but maybe for other developers in the future, we looked at components that were similar. If you see these two components, they come from 2 different configuration places because there are 2 different paragraph types. The one on the corner over there is doing something special with the menu system and why not. But they are both cards and they're styled in different templates. And then we thought, well, we could probably centralize some of that and reuse it so we can repurpose it. And that is where SDCs shine, because now we can just refactor some of the code, have it more modular, have a slot if needed, and then just pass in the extra variables if that happens to be the case.
Yeah, and
And this is an example of that and a follow-up to that, because like as you can see, we have a call to action, which is a block type. So we're moving between paragraph types and block types. And if you're familiar with Drupal 10 or 11, block types was something else that came in 8 that allows you to kind of like really quickly put in an element, a fieldable entity on the page, and that's fine, but it has its own set of templates. So we wanted to actually also standardize this and for them to come in from the same SDC.
Okay, so now we'll get into the, we talked a little bit about the folder structure, get a little bit into the configuration. So I mentioned this earlier, but I want to reemphasize it. Recipes, and especially our philosophy for recipes, when we started planning this about a year ago, I was very adamant that we should create recipes as granular as possible. So we would start with the smallest thing, like an image type, and then we would create that would be a recipe, and then we would create a paragraph type, and we would use that image type in the paragraph type, and keep moving up. After we have paragraph types, then we have a content type, right? So recipes can be used at different layers. You can have a recipe that just has one tiny small thing in it, right? You could have a recipe that has everything in it, and some of the recipe examples on Drupal are like that right now. But you can also include recipes inside of other recipes. So we were working up. I wanted a bunch of small things. So I wanted a very flat hierarchy, a bunch of tiny little pieces, and then the ones that we couldn't, that had to include those tiny pieces, like a paragraph type or a block type, and then the content types, right? And there wouldn't be these huge bundles. They would just trickle down on a very flat hierarchy, so that if we needed that small thing, we didn't have to include a bunch of stuff we didn't want. We could just include that small thing in a new recipe just by pulling it instead of including a whole nother bundle.
Yeah, basically just having the different ingredients laid out for you, because if your recipe is too big, you might end up having to delete configuration, and that's not something that you may want to do. You may want to be able to tell, oh, I like how it's dealing with responsive images, I like how it's dealing with the heroes, I like the paragraph types, I don't really care for anything else, let me just take those out and use them. And this approach allows us to do that, because then we go from the paragraph types, which are all a molecular recipe, and some of the elements inside of the page, into a bundle. And then from the bundle, you can move into a Kickstarter or a starter kit, which is kind of what Drupal is trying to use now on Drupal CMS and a couple of others, which will build that up, add default content, and give you a whole proper experience out of the box.
Yeah, and I will talk about, I think we have a slide for default content later, and talk about how we used it versus how you can use it in a much larger thing. So this is this may look familiar, but we just wanted to repeat the process that when we were building this, we started with the small things, took the configuration, and included the things that you have to have everything in a recipe that it's going to need, either by including it as a configuration YAML file, or by requiring the modules or the Drupal core configuration that exists for that. And we'll get into, I hope we're going to get, So default content. Sometimes you do need content in a recipe, even at very small levels. We have we mentioned block types and paragraph types. Sometimes we had a taxonomy that said, there was a simple one, like, this is a card with the images on the left, or this is a card with images on the right. And those are taxonomy terms. They say image left, image right, right? So that that paragraph type card recipe would include the configuration for the taxonomy, and it would also include content because taxonomy terms are content, right? So that's one way to use default content. Do you want to go?
Sure. So something important about that default content recipe that I feel like we missed in the past is that if you had to give somebody a full experience of your website, you kind of have to give him a database dump. Otherwise, you just basically give him the configuration and you will have a broken page with basically a footer and a header, and that was about it. That is a lot to ask out of like even another developer to actually fill in all the fields, or somebody else who might just want to experience and see all the hard work you put into configuring that page the way that it is. And Drupal allows you to configure the page multiple ways, and I'm sure if you all share some of the configuration you have, we could all learn about each other and how we do it. But if you don't have default content, you're asking me to spend a lot of time clicking in and trying to put it together and see which elements you're still using and which ones might be legacy and maybe something that you haven't deleted just because of some reason, but they are still in there.
Yeah, and so that's where default content can be built in a recipe. You export content as text files, and that's the other end of the extreme. I mentioned just creating a couple taxonomy terms. You can go the other way and create an entire laid out site with content that's not maybe not even lorem ipsum, but just has some examples of real content in it. So if you're building that level of recipe, or you are as we are working to share this stuff with the SBA and maybe even other government organizations, we are also working towards building a default content, profile or example site, that sample site that we want. Yes? Question?
Have you deployed the recipes into any other sites other than SBA?
Not yet. We are very close. I mentioned earlier data.sba.gov. The Open Data Initiative in the government requires most agencies to provide data in an open format that can be read by data.gov. So it provides a list with the data files, and data.gov looks at that list and then scrapes them and brings it up into that. So the current version of the data.sba.gov, again, is out of date and very hard to maintain. So we are implementing a Drupal version of that, and a lot of that is not the same as www. It's not content, but there still will be blocks and headers and all kinds of other things, and there will be some pages that just say, hey, explain things. So we're going to be reusing the recipes and SDCs on the site probably in the next few months.
I was curious about you had one slide about having to copy configs out of the config sync into individual SDC component. If you have run into any issues on keeping them in sync, coming from the recipe.
That's a great question, and it's one we have been thinking through. So when we copy config, it's for a recipe. SDCs technically don't know about Drupal, right? They can be used in any theme. In practice, because we're building on a base theme and we're using a lot of styling, and we're using Twig and we're using the Gulp and Sass, in practice, it's tied to Drupal. But when you look at the files, they don't say Drupal anywhere. A recipe is pure Drupal. Right now, because again, unlike modules and themes, which with Composer and other tools, you can automatically update. Right now, we're treating recipes as a recipe. that you get from like a magazine. You make a copy of it, maybe you tweak it afterwards for your specific taste, and then that. We are not going to try to keep recipes in sync, because again, if anybody remembers using features back in the day and trying to keep your config in sync that way on multiple sites, if you've ever gotten that complicated, you almost immediately have to start using the config over you had to use the feature config override module or the feature config ignore module. So we are not syncing them during this phase. As these things become more mature and there becomes a pattern of practice to keep recipes in sync, we will do that. But right now we're just copying it to use it as our starter. And then if they drift, we'll probably be doing that manually for the first year or so. But yeah, we would love to get them in sync, but that's harder than it sounds right now.
So just one last question. So the right now there's no direction on, say, if there's an update in recipe library for a particular recipe, and on an existing site we'll be using it.
There's no, again, there's no update hooks or anything else, because these aren't modules. So there isn't any of that tooling yet. They are in Drupal core. They are, released. They're not in alpha or beta. But that's one place where it's like, how do we do this? So we would love to know if anybody has managed to do that, and maybe we can talk about that after the presentation. But right now that is one place where both of these SDCs are easier to keep in sync, because styling is easy to update, but the recipes config can sometimes conflict with the changes you made on the individual sites. Yes?
That's one key difference between recipes and distributions. Recipes are intended to be applied once, you set the config, and then you own it, whereas distributions had upgrade paths.
Yeah.
So recipes, at least right now, don't intend to have an upgrade path. You install it once, it sets you up, and then you go forward.
Yeah, it's like I said, that my best analogy is a recipe. You copy it out of a magazine, you print it on the internet, and then you tweak it. I love to cook, so I'm like, oh no, that needs some more Dijon mustard or less sugar or more salt or whatever. And eventually it becomes my recipe, but I don't give it back to the magazine.
Yeah, but the fantastic thing about recipes is that it makes it easier for you to open source a piece of code and maybe lure your employer to be like, yeah, I'm okay with you sharing that, because the recipe is self-contained, doesn't have any security considerations, and you can just tell people, here's a card, here's everything, the SDC with it, go and use it, and collaboration between agencies will probably improve, because as we get ready and this gets a little more mature, and if we get SBS approval, we could probably release it and we wouldn't have to worry. And if it doesn't work for you, it worked at one point in time, and you could start from there and modify it as you need. But we don't have the challenge and burden that comes from profiles and module maintenance, which is like, who wants to take on that for the long term? I'm sure no federal agency wants to be like, oh yeah, I'm going to keep that forever. But if you give people a starting point, you can help them out, and then just be like, from there on is yours. Mm-hmm. And then,
Yeah, we actually have a repository, and we copied everything into it yesterday. But we do have to ask the SBA for permission to make it public. It's private right now. But we're really hoping that again, there's no security, there's no details at all that would even tie it back to the SBA. It's just a government theme. So we're hoping they'll just be like, yeah, go ahead, turn that one and make it public. So we'll let you know when that happens. Okay, so now I turn it over to Bernardo. He's got the demo.
Yeah, let's take a look at a demo. So first, let me go here. So this is just a page, and I run a recipe earlier to have like a couple of the paragraph types that, so these paragraph types are coming in from a recipe, and this recipe was built from the SBA collection that we now have. So it's bringing a couple of different things, an accordion, item, a couple of buttons. So I thought, well, let me showcase the power that SDCs and recipes have together when you can use them on one site. So we have Olivero, a default install of Olivero, and as you can see, if I click edit, this just has paragraphs down at the bottom, and I added it to the basic page type. And then that paragraph have a lot of options. It has the taxonomy that Andrew was talking about, because sometimes people ask you to have a light background, a dark background, the heading, an accordion item, because you want to have them nested inside. And that's all good. And this will be what a recipe will provide. But if I save the page, then you get this. And why you get that? Because you haven't styled it, right? It's coming in with whatever Olivero gives you by default, and that might be fine. But if you're trying to share SDCs, then you probably want to share some of the components, and I'm going to show you how that works. So right here, I have a paragraph. I have two template overrides, and this is using SDCs to basically summon in Olivero accordion container. So I copy over the SDC that we have for SBA, and don't do this though, because I put it into the core folder. This is just for an example. But if you go to Olivero and you drop in the components folder and drop your components from your custom theme, and then you go into the templates, and then you have the template for the paragraph. And this one here, I'm just going to rename it because I named it demo so it didn't take over the page. Then I just have to pass over the variables, but in this case I didn't even have to change the variable names. Why? Because an SDC has the problem that, you know, it's a HTML markup language. So it's HTML, you could probably move it anywhere else, but the variable, the Drupal fields might have a different name. So if you're moving it and you don't have the recipe coupled with the SDC, you have the problem that, oh well, you know, this doesn't find that field because that field doesn't exist, or it's named something else. But if you bundle it with the recipe, now you have both in the same place. So I just do that. I didn't have to change anything there. Let me bust the cache. Let me go back to the page and refresh. And there you go. That is coming in from that SDC component. I didn't have to do anything else besides just executing the recipe and copying over the template and copying over the SDC component as well. And now that's loading that, and that's loading USWDS. Now I did do a little bit of a hack here because Olivero doesn't load USWDS by default. So I actually just added that library. And that's why you see this, and that's what Andrew was talking about earlier, that for our use case, if you're using USWDS on your theme, then this be fine and you wouldn't have to worry about it. But if not, you're gonna have to attach the library because it has to know about those styles. And if I was to comment that out, you will see how that changes quite a bit. Oh.
Maybe it's not as bad as you thought.
Hmm?
We do command shift R on your version.
The libraries might be loading by default.
Huh.
Oh, wait, the file, if you go,
Yeah,
if you go
yeah.
into your, you got the same line.
Yeah.
I don't think the file saved, because there's a threshold.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, that's also an issue.
Oh well. It'd be broken if it wasn't like that. But at least this was just going to show you how much broken it was going to be without it. And so it's not necessarily a big
It's
issue.
more robust than we thought.
Yeah. It's wanting to stay. The styles don't want to go away. So let me just destroy it now.
I
By
didn't save that file.
You didn't say.
You didn't save the file.
You just said site install.
Yep. I'm going to do a site install. Because I don't necessarily care about that SDC anymore. And if I did a drush ULI, now I'm on a clean version of Drupal. And if we go to extend, you see that the paragraphs module is around, but it's not enabled. So now I'm going to run that recipe, and I'm running it this way, although you can run it from within Drush. I'm just going to SSH into the container and execute this one, the content type landing page. Oops. Oh. to be inside the web folder. So that recipe is applying a bundle set of sub-recipes for paragraphs. So now if I refresh this page, you can see that paragraphs is enabled. And then if we go to structure, paragraph types, you can see all the paragraph types that came in with it. And there is a new content type called a landing page. Fully populated, fully set up with all the different views and all the, everything that you will expect that you had on your side on that content type came in and it's ready to be used. And now if I just brought the SDC for that content type, then I will have a similar experience to what you have on your side. So that makes it easy for you to be like, oh, you like this content type, just take it and use it.
Yeah, and we're at time at this point. We got like 4 more minutes, so I think we can stop there. We have some other, like, in the future looking stuff, but we're running out of time. I'm leaving time for questions if there are any.
I have a question. Do you create recipes based on content, or do you receive the content from the client and then build recipes based on, or kind of look at your gallery, look at your cookbook, and see what you have?
So if you were starting a project with a client, you would definitely want to know what they wanted to display, and then use existing recipes if they work. For this client, of course, we built this. We built the new Drupal version from scratch, and then we said, hey, these are really reusable, and we built it in a very reusable way on purpose. So now we're trying to reuse it for other client SBA sites and maybe for other sites. So it's a conversation. But the more tools you build, the easier it is to say to a client, well, the thing you want is, that very specific when you show the menu items, right, where we can show menu items as a card with an icon on it, which is a very, so you choose the submenu and boom, it populates and it's all very automatic. And you can say that's what you need. If you want to show the things that are in this subdirectory of your navigation structure, we got a tool for that. Any other questions? Yes, back there.
Just curious why you chose paragraphs and paragraph types versus block types and layout.
Part of it was historical. I have built sites in both, and both of them have their strengths and weaknesses. More often than not, even though the UI is not as cool and shows you what you're going to see on the front, I've worked for different agencies and on many different projects. A lot more people tend to drift towards paragraph types because it's for the kind of content people we're dealing with. It's easier for them to understand. I'm filling out a header, I'm filling out a footer, and they can imagine what it's going to look like. But Layout Builder definitely has its place, and I built sites in it. And most of what we just described can be applied. Layouts are block type, use the custom block types, and things like that. So there's no reason you couldn't do this with Layout Builder.
So recipes are used in conjunction with the directory component that adds to enhance them.
Yeah, I mean the recipes of the configuration that say, this is the paragraph type and these are the fields on the paragraph type. This is the taxonomies, any configuration of Drupal. Single directory components just style that because, and when you build them together, you know what template file naming is going to be, you know what the style of the classes are going to be on the pieces. So this is what?
They're like half to each other.
Yeah, it's a Venn diagram that overlaps at least half. Technically, you could use both of them separately, but when you use them both together, that's when they become really common.
Because you don't have to change anything. All the variable names will be the same and everything is plug and play.
Yeah.
If you had the SDCs on its own, then you have to modify them.
Yeah, we rushed through it, but you do pass the variables to the SDC with the way he was doing it. And so you can send a different field to the SDC, and it will say, oh, I put that field here, even though the field name is different. So it is more flexible than we may have made it look. But it's best if they're really powerful when they're used together.
Yeah.
One more?
Sure.
Yes?
How much, I guess, did you use any of the concept module for the paragraph types building, or was it all rolled out from scratch?
Which module?
The paragraph types.
But did we use the config?
For concept module.
Config content.
Yeah, no, unfortunately we can't get into it now. When you are exporting a recipe, there is a way to include content, and I don't remember exactly how to do it, and we don't have time to show it right this minute.
So the paragraph types, there are USOPS concept module, I believe, that have those
Okay.
pre-made. So I was just wondering if you decided to call it your own, or if you use. It sounded like you didn't use
It's all our own. I'm not sure that contrib module existed when we built this version. So
Yeah, we started this over 3 years ago, so
yes.
that may be why I'm looking confused, because it may not have been available.
And it wasn't anything that uses recipe, so if you had looked at it and then decided not to use it.
Yeah, again, we started this over 3 years ago, so it might not, what you're describing might not have been available. Okay, I know somebody else, at least one more person had their hand up, but if you guys want to get to the next, what's the next thing? Is it just the
Keynote.
Keynote, yeah. Well,
That's important. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.